the second Saturday of March 1997. William Barnett stood in the middle of the Caldwell County Livestock auction barn with a lead rope in his hand and a pale cream-colored bull at the end of it. The bull was wrong, and everybody in the barn knew it. Too lean, too light, ribs just barely pressing through the hide like fingers under a bedsheet. Long, narrow head, hip bones jutting, the kind of animal that makes experienced cattlemen go quiet in the way they go quiet when they don't want to be rude but can't find anything decent to say. The auctioneer had started the bidding at $75 and gotten nothing. He dropped to $50 and gotten one hand, William's hand, and the whole barn had exhaled at once, the way a crowd exhales when it finally understands the joke. That's when the big man in the green John Deere cap stood up. He was young, maybe 30. The kind of young that comes loaded with certainty, big shoulders, red face, the loud, easy laugh of a man who had never once been the least informed person in a room and had no reason to suspect today would be any different. He turned away from the ring, faced the packed bleachers, and threw his arm out toward William like a showman introducing an act. $50, he said, loud enough for the whole barn. Somebody just paid $50 for a walking funeral. The barn came apart. William didn't move, didn't blink, didn't turn his head. He just stood there in the sawdust with the lead rope in his hand and the pale bull beside him and let the laughter roll over him the way weather rolls over a fence post, loud for a moment and then gone. He paid at the clerk's window. He loaded the bull. He drove home. And he didn't say a word about any of it for the next 10 years. Nobody had seen him come in. That was how William moved through the world. Quietly, without announcement, the way a man moves when he has learned that being noticed early costs more than it's worth. He had arrived before the first lot, found his seat in the back corner, and spent the next hour watching the prices, watching the patterns, watching the way the room behaved when it was certain about something. This room was certain about everything. Hereford bulls went for $300–400, the good ones pushing $5. Black Angus cows moved fast, hands going up before the auctioneer finished his sentence. Men nudged each other, nodded, made small approving sounds when an animal entered the ring that matched what they already believed a good animal should look like. Red and white, black, thick, heavy. Built the way 3 generations of Caldwell County farmers had agreed cattle should be built. William watched all of it and said nothing. He had driven 40 minutes to get here. Left before Sandra was awake, left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Looking at stock," which was true, the way a lot of things William said were true, accurate and incomplete. The $50 was in his shirt pocket. He had been building it for 18 months, small amounts, quietly, the way you build anything you don't want anyone asking questions about before it's ready. He was ready. Then lot 23 came through the gate. The bull was pale, not the warm red-brown of a Hereford, not the deep black of an Angus, but a flat cream color, almost white, under the fluorescent lights. Long in the body where the others had been blocky, lean where the others had been thick. His ribs pressed faintly against his hide, and his narrow head swung once, twice, unhurried, scanning the barn with the calm expression of an animal that had no idea it was being evaluated and wouldn't have cared if it did. The murmuring started immediately. The auctioneer cleared his throat, opened at 75, got silence, the particular silence of a room that has already decided, dropped to 50. William's hand went up, small and quiet, elbow barely leaving his knee, and the whole barn turned at once to find the man foolish enough to bid. That was when the big man in the green John Deere cap stood up. He didn't have to stand. That was what William would carry longest. Not the laughter, not the words, but the fact that the man chose to rise. Chose to turn away from the ring entirely and face the crowd instead, like a performer who has found his moment and intends to use it fully. Big shoulders, red face, the wide, easy grin of a man who had never once walked into a room and found himself on the wrong side of it. He looked at William in the back corner and threw his arm toward the ring. Somebody just paid $50 for a walking funeral. The barn came apart. Men slapped their knees. Someone pointed. The laughter rolled up to the metal roof and back down again and filled every corner of the building, and William Barnett sat inside all of it without moving a single muscle in his face. He didn't look away, didn't look down, just sat with his hands on his knees and let every laughing man in that building get a good long look at him. Let them look. He paid at the clerk's window, counted out the 50 in small bills without hurrying, backed his trailer to the loading chute, walked the pale bull in, latched the gate, climbed into his truck and pulled out of the lot while the auction was still going, while the laughter was probably still warm in the room behind him. He drove home on the 2-lane blacktop with the bull quiet in the trailer and the radio off, and nothing but 40 minutes of flat road ahead of him to think. He wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. He was something the big man in the green cap would never have understood, even if William had tried to explain it, which he would not. He was patient. 18 months before that auction, on a Tuesday in September, William Barnett pulled a livestock trade magazine out of his mailbox and almost threw it away. He didn't subscribe to it. It had come addressed to the previous owner of the property, a man who had sold up and moved to Florida 3 years prior and apparently still hadn't updated his mailing list. William had been throwing them away unopened since he moved in. This time, for no reason he could ever explain satisfactorily, he didn't. He set it on the kitchen table and left it there while he ate supper. Sandra cleared the plates around it. He turned it over. The cover story ran across the bottom in plain black type. The breed nobody knows yet. How Charolais genetics are quietly rewriting the economics of American beef. William read it once standing at the table. Then he sat down and read it again. Then Sandra went to bed, and he read it a third time with a pencil in his hand, underlining things, putting small stars in the margins next to numbers that didn't seem possible until you read the paragraph twice and realize they were. Leaner cattle, faster growth, higher carcass yield, more sellable beef per pound of live weight than any traditional American breed. Premium prices in the markets where buyers had learned to recognize them. And almost completely unknown in this part of the country, which meant the prices hadn't caught up yet, which meant the window was open, which meant the man who walked through it first would be standing in a very different place in 10 years than the man who didn't. William set the pencil down. He stared at the wall for a while, then he started making calls. He wrote to 2 breed associations and got packets of information back within the week. He called a livestock veterinarian named Dr. Aldous Pitts 2 counties over, who had actually worked with Charolais cattle on a research farm in his 20s, and spoke about them with the quiet reverence of a man describing something he'd seen underestimated his whole career. He drove out to meet Dr. Pitts on a Wednesday afternoon and sat in the man's office for 2 hours asking questions and taking notes on a folded piece of paper he kept in his jacket pocket for the next 18 months. Everything checked out. Everything the magazine said, Dr. Pitts confirmed. Everything Dr. Pitts confirmed, the breed association literature supported. The genetics were real. The premiums were real. The ignorance of the local market was real and temporary, and closing, slowly but closing. William folded his notes, put them back in his pocket, and drove home. He didn't tell Sandra, not because he didn't trust her, but because he had learned long ago that a plan spoken out loud too early has a way of bleeding out through the words. He would show her instead. He just needed the right animal to walk through the right gate. He was prepared to wait. He named the bull Ghost. Sandra asked why, and William said because of the color, which was true, and because of how he moved through the pasture in the early morning when the ground fog was still low. Pale and quiet and separate from everything around him, like something that existed slightly outside the normal order of things. Sandra looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him when she suspected there was more to an answer than she was getting, then turned back to the fence and studied the animal for a long moment. What exactly did we spend $50 on, William? It wasn't really a question. It was the spoken version of something she had been turning over since the morning he came home with a strange bull in the trailer and a look on his face she couldn't quite name. He stood beside her at the fence and watched Ghost move along the far edge of the pen, that long pale body unhurried, the narrow head swinging gently. Something nobody else wanted, he said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. He didn't have an answer for that. Not one she could hold yet. So he said nothing, and after a while she went back inside, and William stayed at the fence a little longer watching the bull in the late afternoon light. The neighbors came in the weeks that followed, the way neighbors do when there is something worth talking about. They slowed their trucks at the fence line, leaned out windows, delivered their jokes with the cheerful generosity of men who consider ridicule a form of community service. Some of them had been at the auction. Some had only heard about it. It didn't seem to matter. The story had already taken on the pleasant shape of a thing people enjoy repeating, and William Barnett had become, at least for the season, the county's favorite cautionary tale. He let them talk. He kept Ghost separate from the main herd, fed him well, watched him. The bull was young and needed time before he could breed, and William was in no hurry. Hurry was for men who hadn't thought things through. William had thought this through down to the last detail on a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket. Dr. Carl Renner came out in November for the annual herd check. He was a straight-talking man in his 50s who had seen enough cattle in his career to have opinions about most things and the confidence to share them. He examined Ghost last, working through the rest of the herd first, and when he finally came to the pale bull, he went quiet in a way that was different from his normal quiet. He ran his hands along the animal's back, checked the teeth, stood back and looked. "William," he said finally, "I think you know what you have here." William said he had some idea. "Keep him healthy," Dr. Renner said, latching his bag, "and keep your mouth shut." William nodded. That was already the plan. The calves came in February in the cold, 3 of them in the first week, 2 more before the month was out. Pale and long-bodied from the moment they hit the ground, already carrying Ghost's narrow heads and lean frames, already wrong-looking by every standard Caldwell County had ever agreed on. William checked them each morning in the gray pre-dawn light, moving quietly along the fence the way he moved everywhere, watching them find their legs, watching them grow. They grew fast. That was the first thing he noticed. Faster than the Hereford calves beside them, faster than anything he'd raised before. They were eating and converting and putting on muscle with an efficiency that didn't announce itself loudly, but showed up every morning in small, undeniable increments. The way the truth tends to show up when you're patient enough to watch for it. The neighbors noticed the calves too. Of course they did. They stopped at the fence with the same cheerful certainty they'd been stopping with since the auction, looked at the pale, long-bodied animals moving through the pasture, and delivered their verdicts with the confidence of a jury that has never once considered it might be wrong. They look sick. They look underfed. "You sure there's nothing wrong with them, William?" Sandra must have heard some version of it 6 times that spring. She stopped mentioning it to William after a while. He wouldn't react, and she'd run out of ways to frame it as a question. He just said they were fine. Because they were fine. They were better than fine, and he knew it. And Dr. Renner knew it, and the folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket had known it for 2 years already. In September, he loaded them into the trailer and drove them to the regional cattle market 3 counties over. Far enough that the buyers wouldn't know his face or his reputation or the story about the $50 bull. He wanted the calves to be seen fresh, without the story attached. It took the out-of-state buyer about 45 seconds. The man came down off the bleachers before the lot was even fully settled, walked around the calves slowly, said nothing for a long moment, then looked up at William with an expression that was professional and careful and only barely concealing something else underneath. "These are Charolais crosses." William said they were. The buyer walked around them once more, checked the frames, the length, the way they stood. Then he named a figure that was 15% above what everything else had sold for that morning, and waited to see what William would do. William said that would be fine. He collected his check at the window, walked to the parking lot, got in the truck, pulled the door shut. Then he sat there for a moment in the silence and allowed himself just briefly to smile. That winter, he bred Ghost to 8 cows. The word moved the way good information always moves. Slowly at first, then faster than you expect. through the quiet channels that exist beneath the loud ones. It wasn't William spreading it. He wasn't built for that. It moved on its own, the way results move when they are real enough and consistent enough that other people start doing the talking for you. The out-of-state buyer mentioned the Caldwell County operation to a contact in Nebraska. That contact mentioned it to someone else. A small notice appeared in a regional livestock publication in the spring of 2000. 3 sentences, barely a paragraph, buried in the back pages. And that was enough. In April of 2001, a truck William didn't recognize pulled into his drive. The man who got out was named Roy Decker, a rancher from Oklahoma who had driven most of 2 days to get there. He was somewhere in his 60s, weathered in the particular way of men who have spent their lives outside, and he walked with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has driven a long way and intends to take his time now that he's arrived. He shook William's hand, said he'd read about the operation, said he wanted to see it for himself before he made any decisions. William took him through the pastures without much conversation. Let the cattle do the talking. Roy Decker took his time. He looked at Ghost, who was 4 years old now, and filled out into something that bore almost no resemblance to the pale, uncertain animal that had stood in the auction ring in 1997. He looked at the breeding stock, the calves on the ground, the records William kept in a plain notebook going back to the first season. He asked precise questions and listened to the answers completely before asking the next one. Then he asked what William had paid for the original bull. William told him $50. Roy Decker laughed, not the cruel laugh of the auction barn, but the delighted laugh of a man who recognizes a great deal when he hears one, even years after the fact. He bought a bull that afternoon for $1,800 and loaded him into his trailer and drove back to Oklahoma. And 6 months later, he called and asked if there would be another available in the spring. There would be. By 2003, William was selling 4, sometimes 5 bulls a year. Prices had climbed, $1,800 to $2,500 to $4,500 for the best animals with the cleanest bloodlines and the most documented history. Buyers came from 2 states, then 3. The operation that Sandra had looked at through the fence in 1997 and quietly doubted was now producing animals that serious people drove serious distances to purchase. And then one morning Pete Gruber pulled into the drive. Pete had been at the auction in 1997, had laughed with everyone else, maybe louder than some. He stood at the fence now with his hat in his hands and asked whether William might consider a neighbor discount on a breeding bull. William looked at him for a moment. The spring sale, he said, was open to everyone. No discount. His name was Dale Crisp. William had known it since the auction. Had known it the way you know the name of a thing that has been nailed to a wall in your mind for years. Not obsessively, not with bitterness. Just as a fact that sits there quietly and waits. Dale Crisp, 30 years old in 1997, third-generation John Deere dealer, inherited the franchise from his father who inherited it from his father, the kind of man who had been handed enough of a head start that he had never developed a particularly sharp instinct for what happens when the ground shifts. The ground shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened the way most financial unravelings happen. Gradually, then suddenly, with a long, slow middle section where a man can still tell himself that things are turning around if he squints at the numbers the right way. Equipment sales slowed in 2002 and didn't recover the way Dale had assumed they would. Margins compressed. The inventory he had ordered on credit in the optimistic years sat on the lot longer than the interest payments could comfortably absorb. He made the decisions men make when they are trying to outrun a problem rather than solve it. Borrowed against the next season, bet on a recovery that kept arriving just a little later than expected. By 2004, people in the county had noticed. Not loudly. Nobody in Caldwell County said much about another man's difficulties out loud, at least not to his face. But the lot looked different. Thinner, the gaps between machines wider than they used to be. The sign needed paint. Dale himself looked different. The red face a little grayer now, the big frame carrying something that hadn't been there in 1997, a particular kind of tired that comes not from hard work, but from sustained worry. The confidence was the first thing that went. That specific, loud, unearned certainty that had filled the auction barn and turned a whole room into an audience. It had been ground down, slowly and thoroughly, by 7 years of a business that did not behave the way he had always assumed it would. Meanwhile, 12 miles down the same county road, William Barnett's operation was earning its first ribbons at regional livestock shows. The buyers coming to the Barnett farm now weren't neighbors making social calls. They were serious men from serious distances who had done their research and arrived with questions that assumed a level of knowledge William had spent 8 years accumulating quietly. The Chevrolet premiums that had seemed remarkable in 1999 were simply the going rate now. Ghost's bloodline was documented across 4 states. What had started as $50 in a folded magazine article had become, by any honest measure, the most successful cattle operation in Caldwell County. Anyone paying attention could see the reversal clearly. The question was whether Dale Crisp was paying attention. 10 years. William drove the same 2-lane blacktop to the same auction barn on the second Saturday of March 2007, with 3 bulls in the trailer behind him and the radio off, the way he always drove when he was thinking. The barn looked the same from the outside, same metal roof, same gravel lot, same hand-painted sign above the entrance that had been fading since at least 1991, and nobody had gotten around to repainting. Inside it was different. Fuller. Louder. Buyers had come from further away this time. He recognized faces from Oklahoma, from Kansas, from a ranch operation in Nebraska he had sold to twice before. The Chevrolet's market had matured in 10 years into something serious and well-documented, and the men who followed it seriously had learned which names to follow. The Barnett operation was one of those names now. William found a seat near the back. Same corner, same wall. Some habits outlast their original reasons. His first 2 bulls sold at $4,100 and $4,800 respectively, the bidding moving with the clean, efficient energy of men who knew what they were looking at and had come prepared to pay for it. William made small notes in his catalog and watched without expression and waited for the third. The third was Ghost's son out of his best-producing cow. 4 years old. 230 pounds heavier than his father had been at that age, the same pale cream color but filled out now into something that made even skeptical men straighten in their seats when he entered the ring. The auctioneer opened at $5,000 and the barn responded immediately. $6, $7, $9, $11, $13,000. The gavel came down and the number hung in the air of the barn, the way certain numbers do, not just as a price but as a verdict, a final answer to a question that had been open for a decade. William wrote it in his catalog, circled it once, closed the cover. He was walking to the clerk's window when he heard his name. He turned, and Dale Crisp was standing there. The green cap was gone. He was in a plain jacket, the kind a man wears when he is no longer representing anything, and he looked every one of his 40 years and then some. The gray had come in fully around the temples. The big frame was still there, but it carried itself differently now, without the forward lean of a man performing for a room. He said he had been trying to figure out how to say this for a long time. He said he was wrong, that he had been showing off, playing to the crowd, and he was wrong, and William had deserved better than what he did that day. William listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "I know, and I accept that." A pause. The barn moved around them, indifferent. "Come by the farm sometime," William said. "There's work if you want it." Dale Crisp showed up on a Monday morning in April, with work boots that were too clean and hands that hadn't done this kind of work in a long time, possibly ever. He was there at 6, which William noted without comment. He had half expected the man not to come at all. William handed him a feed bucket and showed him the morning routine and then walked ahead and let Dale follow. That was how it started. No orientation, no explanation of the larger picture. Just the immediate work of the immediate morning. Feeding, checking water, walking the fence line, observing the animals with the particular quality of attention that separates the men who understand cattle from the men who merely own them. Dale worked without talking, which surprised William. The man he remembered from the auction barn had been constructed almost entirely out of noise. The loud laugh, the performance for the crowd, the voice that filled every space it entered and left no room for anything quieter. That man seemed to have been left somewhere along the road between there and here. What showed up on William's farm was someone different, quieter, watchful in a way that suggested he had learned at some cost that watching was more valuable than speaking. William taught the way his father had taught him, by doing, and by letting the other man observe the doing closely enough that understanding arrived on its own without being announced. He didn't lecture, didn't explain things twice if once was sufficient, didn't soften corrections or dress up mistakes as anything other than what they were. When Dale misread an animal's condition in the third week, William told him plainly what he had missed and why it mattered and moved on. Dale didn't argue, didn't deflect. He nodded and filed it, and the same mistake didn't happen again. That was when William began to understand what he was working with. By summer, Dale could walk the pastures and tell you each animal's lineage back 2 generations, without checking the records. By fall, he understood the breeding schedule well enough to anticipate the next season's decisions rather than just execute the current ones. He learned which buyers from which regions were looking for which specific traits, learned how to read the subtle physical indicators that separated a good animal from a great one, learned the patience that the whole enterprise demanded, the long patience of a man willing to wait for results that don't arrive until they're ready. It was, William thought, the education Dale Crisp should have given himself 30 years ago. But a man learns when he's ready to learn, and not a moment before. And some men need to lose something significant before the readiness arrives. By 2009, Dale was a reliable part of the operation. Not essential yet, but reliable, which was its own form of value. A man who had been too loud and too certain at 30 had become, somewhere past 50, someone worth knowing. William didn't say that out loud. He didn't need to. William stepped back from the operation on a Tuesday in the fall of 2013, which was exactly the kind of day he would have chosen for it. Ordinary, unhurried, no ceremony attached. He handed the breeding records to his son Thomas over coffee at the kitchen table, walked him through the things that weren't written down, the judgment calls, and the seasonal rhythms, and the particular way you read certain animals that no notebook had ever quite captured. Thomas listened the way William had always hoped a son would listen. Carefully, without rushing toward the end. Then William put his coffee cup in the sink and went out to walk the pastures one more time, alone, the way he had walked them every morning for 16 years. Ghost was long gone by then. The bull had lived 11 good years, which Dr. Renner had said was a fine life for a bull of his size and disposition, and his bloodline had spread across 5 states and more operations than William had kept exact count of. The pale cream color showed up in pastures from Oklahoma to Montana now, in animals that had never been anywhere near Caldwell County, carrying genetics that had started with a $50 bid in a barn full of laughing men who were absolutely certain they understood what they were looking at. They had not understood what they were looking at. In the barn office there was a shelf that Thomas had been instructed not to clear, not to reorganize, not to improve in any way. On it sat the Livestock magazine, the one that had arrived addressed to someone else on a Tuesday in September 1995 and changed the direction of everything. The cover was worn soft from years of handling, the spine cracked and re-cracked, the pages thick with the particular softness of paper that has been turned many times by the same careful hands. Next to it was a photograph of Ghost as a young bull, taken in the first spring after the auction. Pale and lean and narrow-headed, ribs just faintly visible beneath the cream-colored hide, looking exactly the way every man in that barn had said he looked, like something that would not last, like a bad decision made visible, like $50 thrown into the wind. Below the photograph, in a plain wooden frame, under glass, was a note in William's measured handwriting. Not elegant, not decorated, just words on paper, set down the way William set most things down. Plainly, without performance, meaning exactly what they said. Ghost, purchased $50. Value of his bloodline beyond any number I could write here. The loudest man in the room is never the most dangerous. The quiet one with a plan is. That was the whole story. Everything else was just the years it took to prove it. If this story stayed with you, if you recognized something in William's patience, or in the cost of knowing something the crowd doesn't, then share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There are more quiet men with plans worth knowing about.